this isn't a conventionally academic paper. I'm not presenting results of rigorous research or anything of that sort. It's more of an invitation to people to join into thinking collectively about certain aspects of technology in urban spaces. And the second health warning is that I am, of course, not an urbanist. I come out of the field of science and technology studies, and particularly science and technology policy. But what I want to do today is to look firstly at the role of everyday technology in the city, and to think about the role it plays in our lives and the possibilities it presents for radical change, and also to think about perhaps how we can draw on traditional technologies using modern materials and design techniques as a way of thinking through solutions to some of the problems that currently confront life in the urban environment. I want to start off just with a note about the term technology and the way it often crops up in these kinds of discourses around the city, where the default position is assumption is almost invariably that technology means information technology, that it's IT. And you will actually read reports in which the term technology is used interchangeably to refer to IT, and particularly to some of the ideas that Gordon Faulkner was talking about yesterday about the whole notion of putting sensors all around the city to make cities smart and intelligent and all the rest of it. As I believe I mentioned at the opening session yesterday, I don't like the term smart cities or even smarter cities. I think cities have always been centres of intelligence and creativity and so on. So I'm not going to be talking about this kind of technology. I'm going to be talking about mundane technology and configurations of mundane technologies and how they have shaped and might in the future shape the city. So here's a couple of mundane technologies. The one on the left is the light bulb. That is the version that was extant in the 1880s. Contrary to most people's expectations, the light bulb was not in fact invented by Thomas Edison. He bought the patent for the light bulb off a couple of Canadian engineers, and it had in fact evolved over a number of decades prior to the 1880s, but Edison picked it up at this point and was able to embed it in a system of electrical supply, which revolutionized the city in particular ways. And the other technology here, mundane technology, the one we use every day and don't take any notice of when we use it, is of course the elevator. And there were lifts and elevators actually in use, particularly in construction sites, at least since Roman times. They were not popular, however, as a means of moving people about in a routine kind of way, largely because of fear of what would happen if the supporting rope snapped. And the illustration that you have on the right there is of Otis, the founder of the Otis Elevator Company, a demonstration in 1852 in which he cut through the supporting rope to demonstrate the safety brake that he had invented that would actually stop the elevator car from plummeting down the elevator shaft. By 1857, 5 years later, that technology was embodied in 488 Broadway, the first passenger elevator system for a high-rise building. And because of the conjunction of these two technologies, this is possible. This could not have happened without the kind of system-building activity of those entrepreneurs. So one of the things I want to think about is some other aspects of technology which perhaps have had similarly dramatic effects, and to think about how we might think about changing the ways in which they presently operate. And I'm going to, of course, anticipate Anique Hommels just a little bit. I'm not going to say too much about this because she is going to say a great deal more. But just to flag up the ideas of socio-technical lock-in and path dependency, you all, of course, are familiar, many of you will be familiar with the whole example, but you're all familiar with the sequence of letters there. It's the top line of the standard English keyboard, which, contrary to many people's expectations or understandings, was not designed to speed up typists, but was actually designed to slow typists down. Because when typing machines were originally introduced, typists were too fast and they jammed the keys that went up to hit the roller. So this keyboard was invented actually to slow people down. Now, in 1983, when I first started working at the Oak Ridge National Lab, one of the US's leading technology labs in the US, I had one of these things on the left on my desk, an IBM golf ball typewriter, already no keys. It had a golf ball mechanism So you didn't really need the QWERTY keyboard to slow anybody down. A couple of years later, I got my first Apple II, which replaced the golf ball typewriter. No printing device at all that's dependent upon the rate at which you're interacting with the keyboard. Why do we still today have this? Well, of course, it's because it's not just the kit, it's the system, the socio-technical system in which it's embedded, and we have things like typing courses, touch typing techniques, secretarial schools, so on and so forth. So actually changing that technology is not something which has thus far been appealing. A related concept is path dependency, and there's a rather fanciful story that some people have woven about the relationship between the diameter of the boosters on the space shuttle here and the Roman war chariot. I don't have time to go through it in full detail, but the story apparently goes that the boosters were built by Morton Ecole in the Midwest. They had to be transported to Florida through railway lines. They had to go through rail tunnels. The size of the rail tunnels was shaped by the fact that the railways had the 4 foot, 7.5, whatever it is, the standard English gauge of rails, because they were built by English railway engineers. Why did English railway engineers use that gauge? Supposedly because the first English railways used coal trucks that were on rails, and those coal trucks had been built on the same jigs as carts, and medieval carts had a standard wheel distance between their wheels because of the ruts in the road, and the distance of the ruts in the road was originally set down by the fact that the original roads were the Roman roads built for war chariots, and the Roman war chariot was pulled by 2 horses side by side, and therefore the width of the Morton Ecole booster was determined in some sense, or path dependent upon the width of the Roman horse's arse. So, that may be a little bit fanciful, but it gives you a general idea of the way these sorts of things can operate. So let's just look at a few bits of kit. This is one that's been highly instrumental in shaping the system of cities around the world. It is, of course, the sailboat, which was the primary way for millennia by which human beings travelled great distances and hauled heavy loads, and as a result, about 25 of the world's largest cities, 300 million population, live on the coast, and they are living close to sea level, in many cases below sea level on reclaimed lands and so on, which are prone to flooding. And one of the technologies which traditionally we have employed to deal with this situation is to build hard flood defence technologies. This is the Thames Barrier. Of course, the Dutch have a much bigger one. Forgive my pronunciation, I think it's Oosterskelderkring in the Netherlands. But this is not necessarily a viable technology, for example, for the large numbers of people who live in the Ganges Delta, where you don't have the opportunity to deal with coastal flooding in that way. And it's kind of interesting to see here a lesson being drawn from traditional adaptation to variable water levels. These pictures are, in fact, of the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia. There's a couple of interesting conditions here. One is the Tonle Sap River is the only one that reverses its flow over the course of the year. In the wet season, water flows from the Mekong into the Tonle Sap. In the dry season, the water flows out of the Tonle Sap back into the Mekong. It's a very shallow lake. It's a very important fishing resource. But as a result of its shallowness and this dynamic of the river flow, the lake edge varies by many kilometres between wet and dry seasons. So if you build your home on the edge of the lake in the wet season, you're in trouble. You've got a long walk to work in the dry season, and vice versa. Added to which, these people are mostly too poor to buy land, and their solution has been to build their communities actually on the water. And you find this phenomenon actually over quite a lot of the East, and we now see Dutch architect engineers, particularly Kern Ulthuis, other Dutch architects and engineers, now actually taking very seriously the idea of giving up the hardcore approach to protection from sea encroachment, and thinking actually about floating buildings. While we're on the subject of water, here's another technology that's been very important in shaping the city. Can't imagine New York City or Manhattan without these. This is, of course, the siphon-operated flushing toilet. Nobody in their right minds would have invented this. We purify billions of litres of water to potable quality, 40% of it we flush down toilets. This is absolutely insane. How did that happen? Well, it actually happened because of the coincidence of concerns about things like the Great Stinks of Paris and London in the 1850s, and which was leading to put sewers underground. We've heard reference to Bazalgette sewers and so on. And at the same time, the desire to avoid cholera and contagious diseases, which led to the introduction of piped drinking water. And of course, Thomas Crapper's bit of technology here linked those two systems together in a way which has now become the global standard for sanitation, even though in many respects we would say it was certainly not sustainable. And I just want to note here that the interests of the developed world and the developing world may actually be coinciding as we're seeing the collapse of the kinds of water supply and sewage infrastructure that we've been relying on here for the last 100 years, at the same time as we're seeing increasing water demand in semi-arid areas. And it's worth noting that the Reverend Henry Mole in the same year as Thomas Crapper filed the patent on the Mole earth closet. And if we hadn't had that coincidence with the systems of water, we might today be going for a mole rather than going for a crap. And we might be using some kind of advanced composting technology rather than the water supply system that we currently use. Here's another piece of kit that has done a lot to shape the city over the last 50 years. Some people might say even caused the misshaping of the city. That is, of course, the air conditioner, which has caused the global homogenization of architecture, domestic and commercial, given us problems with the urban heat island and so on and so forth. And it's again interesting to see the way in which some advanced architects and engineers are picking up traditional alternatives to energy-intensive active air conditioning as a way to heat and cool buildings, as the Queenslander House at the top there with the 360-degree air circulation, at the bottom a new building on the Okanagan campus of the University of British Columbia that employs some of the same kinds of cooling techniques. On the right, the wind tower, which is a technology used from Morocco all the way through to Yemen, and there's Norman Foster's version of it, which was designed by aircraft engineers to take the best advantage of the knowledge about fluid dynamics to ensure the most efficient conduct of air from the higher level down into the area in the street below. Can't talk about technology shaping the city without the car. It's kind of interesting to note that it was only in 1896 that in Britain we repealed the Red Flag Act, which required a person to walk in front of a car carrying a red flag, restricting the speed of the car to 4 miles an hour. If I had time, I'd tell you the story about that. It was also, by the way, the year of the first pedestrian traffic accident, as a result of which the Croydon coroner said, by the way, this must never be allowed to happen again. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? But I don't have time for that. But it only took 50 years from that to the time when we had autobahns, the LA freeway system, and now you see this kind of configuration in Shanghai, where the car has clearly become fundamental in shaping the morphology of our cities. In 1900, however, the average speed of traffic in central London was 11 miles an hour. In 2000, the average speed of traffic in central London remained 11 miles an hour. So we may actually think, what are the alternatives to the car? And I was suggesting here that we can learn a lot from the bike. From a relatively recent innovation that's proliferated, the idea here is that we may well see the replacement of the private motor vehicle in an urban context by a set of autonomous pods that can move around the city. They never need to park, so you free up loads of real estate for much more productive use than leaving your car in them. You don't have to worry about drinking and driving. These are driverless. All you have to do is just simply you get out your mobile device and say there are 4 of us going to the station, and a computer program will divert one of these from its existing trajectory to pick you up and take you. And of course the billing will also be automated and all the rest of it. So there are these kinds of possibilities as well that are interesting and exciting. But the thing is, how do we think about how we get from the existing locked-in technology to a future technology that we want to lock in? And I just want to point here to this little bit of kit on the left. It's one of my favourite examples of transitional technology. And it was marks the transition between away from the only energy source humanity has ever given up. Anybody know what that is? Whale oil, exactly. It's the only source of energy we've ever given up, and we didn't do it because we were running out of whales, or we were concerned about hunting them. We did it because kerosene was cheaper and easier to obtain, and the critical thing is you could burn it in the same lamp. And these other technologies here, I think, represent other similar transitional opportunities. We were able to transition away from chlorofluorocarbons under the terms of the Montreal Protocol, largely because we had alternative gases that could be used pretty much in the same equipment, air conditioners, fire extinguishers and so on, as the chlorofluorocarbons were used. So we were able to have a transition there. Here's what I predict is a transitional technology, the hybrid car. I believe we will not see any of these in another 10, 15 years' time, as we will have moved either entirely to electric cars or fuel cell vehicles. But this is very clearly a necessary transition. But we still have to have the internal combustion in the engine in there to cope with people's range anxiety. The notion that somehow or other they're going to run out of battery power. Anyway, so those are just a few thoughts. And as I say, this is really just an attempt to stimulate people and to invite engagement in thinking about these kinds of things. And I will just leave you finally with this artwork. This is an installation by the Argentinian artist working in Frankfurt, Thomas Saraceno. This is actually an installation he did in Hong Kong. He talks about the sky cities. And I use this not because I'm actually seriously suggesting that we're going to be floating around in bubbles at any time in the near future, but who knows, at least not these kinds of bubbles. But to leave you with the thought that the flexible city isn't just a design challenge, it's not just a technical challenge, it's a challenge to the human imagination. Thank you.
It's always difficult following Steve, partly because it's difficult following Steve because he said quite a lot, and I think he's impinged upon my, I wouldn't say territory, but sort of some of the areas of interest that I have. So anticipating that, I'll talk about something rather different. I want to talk about two things. One is a UN Habitat report that I've been associated with, and the second is trying to sort of link together cities' mobility and climate change. The report that was published in October of this year, and if interested I suggest you it's downloadable, was it's one of a series of reports that are produced every 2 years by UN Habitat on themes relating to cities. And this was the first one that was linked in with mobility. And it's quite a complicated process, but I was one of the 6 lead authors in terms of trying to put this together. And I think, and as I'll show you at the end, I think it comes out with some quite interesting messages for cities with respect to urban mobility, but also aspects relating to how transport can better relate to what the city is actually there to do. On the right-hand side here and I've got sort of 3 sort of bits of snapshots, I suppose, of what's happening in some senses in the city, is where we're actually now. And this is a sort of, from The Guardian, it's a sort of hit parade, and it looks over the period 2007 to 2025. And it looks at the relative position. So if the arrow is horizontal, it maintains its position. If it's in the sort of yellowish, it's moving up the hit parade, and blue moving down the hit parade, and red are the new entries into the hit parade. And what it's suggesting is that there's substantial growth in the number of so-called megacities, over 10 million, so from 19 to something of the order of 25 over this period of time, and what some people are now calling meta-cities, which are areas that have populations in excess of 20 million. But it should be noticed that I think that when one talks within the context of the UN Habitat report, one's talking about sustainable mobility, is to be clear the different conceptions and the interpretations of sustainable mobility in different parts of the world, whether it's over consumption and pollution, whether it's over, which is what the western cities, the northern cities are looking at primarily, or whether it's the poorer cities in the south that are looking at income generation, health, clean water and other factors. So we're looking at very different perspectives on this problem. But what is a general issue here is that urbanization is taking place, huge amounts of migration into the cities, the growth of middle class consumption within cities. And as we've heard over these last 2 days, cities being the sort of the centre of economic, social, cultural, knowledge-based activities, centres of creativity, innovation and skill. So that's one part of the picture. The second part is the growth in mobility that's taken place looking backwards and trying to look forwards. Many of us like looking forwards, but because it's uncertain, it's uncertainty. But what I've tried to do here is take 3 time slices: 1950, 2005, and 2050. The industrialized economies, the reforming economies, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and developing economies, and looking at what has happened. And the figures in the right-hand column relate to 2 different projections for 2050, and that's explained at the bottom. One from a study at MIT and one from the IPCC AR4 report, the previous report. But what it's suggesting is that we're looking at a doubling of the number of vehicles. We're looking at this being even a doubling in cities, but also looking at huge growth in the amount of travel that each individual undertakes. So even in the industrial cities, we're looking at a 2 times growth there, perhaps a 3 times growth in the reforming and the developing economies. And most of this will take place in the cities. This is where the income is, this is where the richer people are living, and this is where the growth will take place. So on the right-hand side there, it suggests that in 2010 we have 825 million cars, and 70% of these are in developed countries, over 1 billion vehicles in the world. This is likely again to double over the period to 2050, and it should be noted that this doesn't include motorised 2- and 3-wheelers, which are hugely important in many cities in the world. Now the question here I would pose is, can the cities handle this? And I can't see a way in which the cities can handle this sort of growth. If we look at sort of cities, probably about in the richer countries, say in London or in Oxford and that sort of place, about 20% of the land space is allocated to transport-related activities. This is ground-level land use. In some of the US cities, it's more than that because the cities are more extensive, so one's talking about 30, or in some cities even 40% of the land space is used for transport and travel-related activities. In many of the emerging cities, in the east, in the south and east, we're talking about 8 to 10, possibly 12%. We've got far less space available. And remember, that space isn't just used for travel, it's used for a range of other activities, like it's used for markets, it's repairs, it's people talking, it's social space as well as space for transport. So the question here is, how do we actually handle that as a problem? If we know this problem is occurring, do we knock down whole parts of cities and rebuild them so that it can accommodate the car or something like that? Or do we look at it in a rather more imaginative way? And then thirdly, the other part of the equation, as it were, that we haven't really talked about so much over the last couple of days is looking at the issue relating to climate change and CO2 emissions and other global warming gases. This table, taken from IEA, the International Energy Agency data, shows the distribution. In a sense, it's what one would expect, but it should be noted that if we look at the per capita figure that's in column 3, that even in China now, we have over 5 tons of CO2 per person emitted when the world average is above the world average. So China is up there above, India is still below, Latin America is still below. We look at transport, which is in the next 2 columns as a proportion of that, which is the figure in the final column. We see a slightly different picture in terms of the amount of the CO2 which is actually contributed by transport. But if we're looking at this growth that's likely to take place, unless this, I don't think it's going to be a mundane technology, it's going to have to be a very unmundane technology, that we're going to have to look at the proposition that if the numbers of people wanting to move around by car and long distance by air, that those figures in the far column are likely to be like that, likely to be considerably increased on those figures. And the question there is, is that something that society or global, the globe can actually handle? These are national figures, but probably 70% of those will be in urban areas. That's where the action is taking place. So there's huge inequality both in terms of the current emissions and the legacy of the last 150 years. There are global sort of targets, but not anything that actually has any real power to it. It's looking within the OECD countries at the mechanisms, I suppose, by which one can actually get the levels down to about 1 ton of carbon dioxide per person. And I'd be very interested to know from the audience here as to what or how you propose to actually achieve that sort of change over the next 40 or 50 years. So if we bring this all together, what does this actually tell us? And what are the implications for this so-called flexible city? Over the period, the last 100 years, sea level has risen by about 0.2 of a metre. So we're talking there about 8 inches of increase. And we're looking into the future to 2100 from the latest 2013 IPCC report of a possible 24-inch increase on top of that. So the top graphic shows about sea level rise, and this is the sort of the estimates or some estimates of the population displaced by climate change to 2050. The big red blobs are extreme. These are where there will be more than 1 million people who will have to be moved. The high, the sort of brown colour, is between 50,000 and 1 million rather, and the medium is lower than that. And as we've already heard, many of the great cities of the world are at sea level on river estuaries, subject to exactly these sorts of events. And then more mundanely, a UK example, this is Tewkesbury in July 2007, where in this country we had 130 millimetres of rain over a 5-day period. The town, is about 12,000 people, was cut off. The only way into the town was by an old railway viaduct, and the only way to get across that was by a cycle or walk. So this was a car-free area for a short period of time. There was also no clean water for 140,000 homes in the area for a period of 2 weeks, so it polluted the local system. So the thinking here is, and this is a report that we've helped with the OECD has produced on looking at resilient and flexible infrastructures, is how do we change the dynamic to look at investment in low carbon infrastructure. Secondly, and I think this is where there's a huge area for potential, is that how can we make much better use of the existing capacity that there is within various systems that we have. In the transport area, in many situations, there are vehicles travelling around with just one person in them. It is not an efficient use. You have a lot of empty space there. In public transport, the same can be said. In freight transport, the same can be said. So how can we make the best use in terms of the efficiency of the operation of the system? Through yield management that's used in airlines, through load factors, and other mechanisms. How can we make and implement demand management? And this is pricing and regulation on all forms of transport. So that's prioritising different types of transport within different areas in the city. We are looking at trying to sort of maintain that existing infrastructure. Can we promote more efficient forms of transport, the walking, cycling and public transport, and using technology? And embedded within all of that is the appropriate governance and organisational structures. The political will and leadership that we've actually heard about today, the transparency, the accountability, public trust, support and participation. But what this is really saying is, what sort of cities do we really want in 30 or 40 years' time? How do we see those cities evolving in terms of what they're doing, in terms of the people who are living there, in terms of the wealth they're creating, and how can transport and mobility actually fit into that? So high levels of interconnectivity lead to the need for resilience, and this, again, disruption becomes intensely more disruptive. So potential, Copenhagen is often taken. I think it's a good example. It's intending to be carbon neutral by 2025. Huge amount of cycling. and people are, the whole sort of underlying rationale has changed, that people see that as the way to get around the city. Things like accidents, which is often a concern for cyclists, have reduced substantially over the recent past. And interestingly, when surveyed, when talked to, they talk about the benefits of cycling as being speed, convenience and health, which is what one is trying to look for in cities, in flexible cities. The diagram to the left shows the 13 new cycle highways that they're introducing into Copenhagen, and Copenhagen has quite a severe climate. Cycling is carried out all around the year. The consequences, we could take many examples. This is October 2011 in Thailand, well known. Central Bangkok, the blue areas show the flooded areas within Bangkok. The water levels were raised by 3 meters, and the main industrial area that was producing microchips for much of the global system and hard disks was flooded, and also one of the 2 airports within Bangkok was flooded as well. The damage, the cost is huge, and this again may be one way in which some reason comes out on this, is the huge costs to society, both in terms of output and things, but also in terms of fatalities, in terms of inconvenience and all the other sorts of things that are actually caused. So what then does the UN Habitat report actually state? And I'm sure that many of you have worked within these sort of organisations, and how difficult it is to make progress and get agreement in terms of what can actually be said at the end of that process. But I think this actually says a series of quite important things. We've talked about the influence, the dominance of transport, and the increasing dominance of private transport, the issue of accessibility being so important, and the way in which mobility is intertwined with many other types of activity. But point 4 is trying to shift focus to people and places, not to travel itself. Why do people actually travel? So it's looking at travel as the means rather than an end in itself. The accessible city, the opportunities that this actually provides for people to be close together, provides the safe and efficient pedestrian and cycling environment with high quality public transport. So the whole emphasis in this report is moving away from the car, away from roads, towards encouraging other forms of interaction and getting people together. Urban policies seem to be hugely important, and the priority for funding is for non-motorised and high-capacity public transport. And again, the institutional and government structure to oversee this. So I think progress is being made, that this is this document actually should and will have impact in the way in which certainly some people in some cities actually look at the problems of transport. And this is my favourite graphic at the moment, which the colour suggests that it comes from the Financial Times. That's true, it does come from the Financial Times. And the caption they use is, "We live in financial times." My caption would be, but can we afford not to take action? Thank you very much.
Good morning, bonjour. I'm kind of fake Frenchman, so I'll insert a kind of bonjour there just to open up the languages we're talking here. Thanks very much to the organisers. I apologise, I've got a bit of a headache. So I'm not sure that I'm the only presenter this morning who's got a headache. He says glaring at the session discussant. So I hope to make some sense anyway. I want to share some modest ongoing reflections around infrastructure transitions, urban socio-technical change and their politics. And I think it kind of fits quite nicely with the 2 previous papers, but also some of the things which we've heard in the previous sessions yesterday and this morning as well, if I'd actually arrived on time this morning. So using, and I want to do this by using my particular reading of district heating systems in Paris and Stockholm to do this. And here I should acknowledge straight away ongoing work, ongoing discussions with colleagues at LATS around cities and energy, and especially Olivier Coutard with whom I work quite closely when he's not busy doing administrative and directorship stuff, but with whom I've started looking at the Paris side, and particularly the question of district heating as an instrument of Paris energy climate policy. So infrastructure is obviously crucial to city futures, and energy infrastructure is a major instrument in defining pathways to low or to post-carbon transition. So on one level, infrastructure, like district heating, is a means or a tool or a set of mundane, even technical artifacts, as this quote kind of illustrates a little bit. It's a kind of set of mundane technical artifacts through which various things can be done or addressed, wider policy objectives can be met, etc. So part of the reason I'm interested in district heating and its very technical web of boilers, energy mixes, peak and base loads, contracts, tariffs, regulations, etc. Part of the reason I'm interested in this is that this system and the changes to this system, it's this system and the changes to these systems which are actually driving or delivering actual or desired urban decarbonisation, including, interestingly enough, increasingly in the UK. But the other reason for an interest in district heating as well is more intellectual reflections that I have. It's because I think it mediates or translates some of the political debates around urban futures, some of the questions that we've been focusing on here of finance, investment, the scales of governance, the practices of governance, heat as a commodity versus heat as a public service, metabolisms, solidarities, and if we were to go into the kinds of everyday politics of this, then we'd also bring in questions of comfort, the experience of being hot and cold, etc., etc. So all this is nothing very new, but the more interesting questions to me, anyway, are about when and how infrastructure becomes more than a backdrop or a stage, and becomes political. And the technical bits are an important element in this process, but because of the diverse contested ways in which they kind of become active or vital, to use some of Jane Bennett's recent political theory, they become, it's because of the diverse contested ways in which they become active or vital that they become interesting from a political point of view. So if the urban is the material made political, then it's worth pondering how infrastructure and technological artifacts come to participate in doing change or doing transition, in opening up pathways of change, possible alternatives, the way in which they reveal difference, etc., etc. So that's an ongoing set of more theoretical reflections which are going on in my head at the moment, and which I'm trying to connect with some of the more empirical meat, which I'm going to present here in a very thin slice in probably less than 5 minutes. So I apologise for that. But anyway, the idea of looking at Paris and Stockholm is that they both start from similar start points. So over the last 15 years or so, we have energy climate strategies based on decarbonisation. So you can have energy strategies which are based on other things apart from decarbonisation or climate change mitigation. But here we have two cities implementing or developing climate strategies and energy strategies based on decarbonisation with shared deadlines, so dramatic CO2 reductions by around 2050, if not before. And they use common tools, especially this common tool or instrument of district heating networks, because Paris and Stockholm have two of the oldest and the most extensive district heating systems in Europe, or even in the world. But the two cities have, in terms of CO2 emissions reductions, in terms of decarbonisation, over the last 15 years or so, they're very different achievements according to what the city says that it's actually done. So Stockholm, on the one hand, has dramatically reduced its CO2 emissions by more than 25%, I think, since 1990, from 1990 to 2010, while Paris CO2 emissions are at best remaining stable, and in some cases or in some sectors are actually on the increase. And in Stockholm, for example, you can actually clearly see the weight of the district heating sector in explaining CO2 reductions. Maybe you can't see it on this graph, but it's the kind of light blue top of the top of the wedges, which is you can tell that it's increasingly over time, it's increasingly reduced in terms of tons of CO2 emissions. So a quick table comparing district heating systems in Paris and Stockholm. So they both have old systems, similar production capacities. The interesting bits are in terms of the differences in terms of the total heat provision. So whereas Stockholm district heating represents up to 80% of the total heat market share, in Paris a lot smaller share of the market. And in terms of the energy mix as well, in Stockholm a largely decarbonised or a largely fossil fuel, almost fossil fuel free or close to fossil fuel free system. Yeah, in Paris we still have a large amount of fossil fuels in there, and both based on public-private kind of governance in which the municipalities are involved but do not have all the control. They've actually devolved some of the control to private sector partners with varying results. So multi-positionality of the municipalities, both of the cities have different perspectives on this question of district heating. Sometimes the authority which actually is responsible for signing the contract with the company. They're also a shareholder earning the money from the system. They're a customer. They're actually providing the waste which actually is used for the energy production, and they're a policy maker, as we've seen in terms of developing climate policy. So quickly, in Stockholm, a few vignettes of what's been going on. We've seen a district heating system which has been spatially expanded, which has been interconnected. There are a lot of different interconnected, different separately functioning systems around Stockholm, which through regional cooperation or cooperation between municipalities have gradually been interconnected. There's also been an intensification of district heating in terms of removing old boilers out of large multi-family housing buildings and transforming them and putting them onto the district heating network as well. So there's a kind of there's a spatial expansion, interconnection, intensification of district heating over the last 15 years or so in Stockholm. At the same time, you have a system which is increasingly based on renewables and recuperation technologies, so biomass and waste incineration, with a progressive elimination of fossil fuels. So, I mean, the pictures show the top picture shows a waste incineration plant, which now provides the base load, or one of the base loads, for the production of district heating across the Stockholm region. The other pictures show there's all sorts of things going on in terms of operational landscapes, as we were talking about yesterday with Neil Brenner, about the mobilization of import of olive kernels as biomass from Greece and Tunisia into district heating plants because they are hydrophobic and they don't contain much water, etc. There was a ship which came from Naples, which brought all the waste from Naples to Stockholm so that they could burn it for district heating, things like that. So there's all sorts of interesting developments which are going on, which are leading to the fact that we only have peak load fossil fuels left in the system. But at the same time, there are all sorts of questions which are either being downplayed or bypassed by this kind of decarbonisation, fossil fuel-free discourse. So debates about ownership, influence, pricing. They've changed with the involvement of a kind of private sector partner. They've changed the pricing from cost-based pricing to market pricing based on alternatives, and alternatives in a dense urban fabric. Alternatives for heat are extremely expensive, so that's allowed them to increase the prices quite substantially, and this has been highly contested. We also have questions about network bypass partly because of the pricing issues that some municipal housing companies, so another bit of the municipality which actually owns the system, another bit of the municipality is actually contesting the actual use of these systems and is proposing perhaps to bypass and use alternative systems so that their residents can benefit from more efficient or greener or lower cost heating. And the questions about fossil fuel, when this is actually going to be. There's this goal for 2050, but it was presented as quite a linear a linear method for or linear track for being actually being able to reach this, and that brings up all kinds of questions about knowledge, expertise, resources around this goal and around the actual work which actually needs to be done in order to reach it. And in Paris, if we go through some of the issues in Paris, there's all sorts of questions, similar kinds of questions around the role of the municipality versus GDF Suez, which has a controlling share through one of its subsidiaries in the heating company. There's tensions between district heating and obviously low carbon French electricity, which is used by a lot of households in central Paris for actual heating. There's a nuclear taboo in the debate, the political debate on the energy transition in France at the moment. The nuclear question has been totally evacuated from any discussions. There's also kinds of questions in Paris in particular about large numbers of buildings actually being multifamily, co-property owned and functioning buildings, which means in order to change systems or in order to do anything with utilities, you have to have agreement between families living on different floors, families in different situations, etc. And that's a whole, obviously brings up a whole set of discussions between different people. And then there's various things about the energy mix and cheap coal still being used, etc. More things about the actual metabolic resources which are drawn in from afar and pushed further away. And then similar to in Stockholm, we have this objective of interconnection of networks, but for all these reasons which I mentioned here, this is not proving particularly possible because of the different technologies being used between different systems, the different contract times. Contract times of one municipality are due to run out in 5 years' time, but another municipality it's in 10 years' time, and you can't actually bring the two sets of temporalities together in order to be able to interconnect the system and make it more efficient. Whole kinds of things about the sheer politics of digging up streets in Paris. There is now a moratorium for 1 year in Paris about doing street works because next year there's the municipal elections and the politicians don't want any of the electorate to think we'll use this as a voting issue, etc., etc. So, and that gets, that's a picture of the kind of fragmented situation of district heating networks in the Paris area, which in the current situation, current political lock-in which they have is going to remain like that for a substantial time. And then questions about upscaling governance and the right scale for actually doing this kind of district heating provision. So I've been grappling over what this actually means and how to interpret it. So, I mean, there's broader questions here about tensions in urban political economies and urban political ecologies of infrastructure, the limits of the network city, the temporalities and specialities of energy transitions. At the same time, you can read the Stockholm case, at least in terms of the way that the city sells itself as a kind of, they've managed to gain sufficient alignment of actors onto the pathway that they've chosen in some respects, whereas the Paris case is more based on inertia and path dependency. And you can read all sorts of factors in the two cases about why that happens like that in the two cities. What I wanted to conclude with was, though, to come back to these broader questions of politics and urban materiality and thinking through some of the alternative ways of following energy flows through the urban fabric. So there's all sorts of questions here about the multiple interpretations, the multiple flows, the multiple capacities and powers of actors to do things, and the way in which these disrupt and disorder linear pathways, particularly when you're talking about transitions. Transitions has a very means different things. It's a term which means different things to different people in different political academic contexts. And so, you know, anything we can do to disrupt and disorder the idea of normative linear pathways to a or to the transition are particularly useful from my perspective. And then I'm hopefully beginning to, or I would like to try and think through some of the more the work on active urban materiality and how the grid speaks, how district heating actually speaks and participates in these processes and in the construction of the politics and how the politics overflows from infrastructure, etc. I'll stop there.
this conference is about flexible cities, but my previous work is mainly dealing with inflexible cities. So the book that I wrote, Unbuilding Cities, deals with the urban obduracy, and I will spend part of my presentation on that issue of obduracy and try to link it up with my more recent research on urban vulnerability and disasters. I have a background in STS, Science, Technology and Society Studies, not in urban studies, which might make a difference to the way I look at cities, the way I conceptualize cities. In the previous presentations, we have seen examples where the presenters focused on specific urban technologies like district heating or elevators and so on. In my work, I see it a bit different, although I think it's also related. I look at the city itself as a huge socio-technical artifact, because in the city, social groups, people, leaders come together and also have to deal and construct infrastructures, buildings, and so on. Building on earlier work by Wiebe Bijker and Eduardo Aybar in an article they wrote on the extension of Barcelona, they are also STS scholars, I also conceptualize urban change as an innovation process. They started with this perspective in their article. And I then also applied constructivist notions derived from models like Scott's social construction of technology and the actor network theory to urban planning. Basically, I focus on two problems in cities. As I said, the obduracy of existing urban structures. So obduracy referring to the resistance to change, to the slow change that often happens in cities. So we talked about path dependency. Often these urban processes are very time consuming and also as a result of that often also very expensive. Then also, well, maybe that's the opposite side. That's why I like to combine those two problems in one presentation. That's the urban disaster. So where something disastrous happens in a city, where a huge part of a city might be completely devastated, demolished. And that you can see as an example of a very sudden, very radical change, where as a result of a disaster, a completely empty space in a city can be a result, and that would then maybe imply that change would be very easy. You have a radical change all of a sudden, and you have the planners and the citizens are left with a kind of tabula rasa, which they can then maybe quite easily redesign or redevelop. And that could be a hypothesis which I will discuss in this presentation, showing that it's not that easy, of course. Urban obduracy, mainly talking about the tension between attempts to change cities, to bring about this urban innovation, and the obduracy of what is already there. Structures that are deeply embedded, also historically rooted in a city, and that are hard to change. Why is it so difficult to make these changes? And in my earlier work, I developed 3 different models to explain this urban obduracy, and my method in trying to grasp this problem of obduracy was to follow the actors, so the people involved in making changes in cities and how they give meaning to urban artifacts and how they understand urban obduracy. And I also focus very much on local case studies, also to show that urban obduracy is in fact contextual, dependent on the context, and can also change over time. So cities can experience periods of obduracy, but this obduracy can then also be undone. Urban disasters, I think that's really interesting to focus on these urban disasters, also because you can think about the relations between disasters and innovation. Think about a disaster. I just described a situation where you have a completely empty space. It might also, although of course people often would conceptualize and see a disaster as something completely negative, as something that should be avoided at all times. I agree with that. But at the same time, you can argue that this urban vulnerability can also lead to new creativity, improvisations, and perhaps opportunities for change that you would otherwise not have had the possibility for. So what I would try to do in this presentation is to link up this idea of urban obduracy and look at this problem in a post-disaster situation of a specific city that I investigated. This time not a story about huge global cities, but about a smaller Dutch city in the east of the Netherlands, the city Enschede. In May 2000, a fireworks storage facility exploded in a quite heavily populated neighborhood in this city. And 23 people died as a result of that explosion, and about more than 500 houses were demolished. And this is a picture of that huge explosion in the year 2000. This is a picture of the situation a few days after the disaster. So you can see in the middle of this picture, a huge demolished, devastated area, and that was the location of this fireworks factory. What is important to know is that in this city, and that happens in more places in the Netherlands, it's a kind of an industrial city, or it has an industrial past. A lot of textile industry in this city in the past. And that meant that industrial properties, industrial factories, were kind of integrated in residential areas. So that also implied the human loss and the loss of houses as a result of this disaster. Now take a clear look at this picture, and then I show you the picture, which is kind of in a similar angle of 10 years later. So this is the picture of 2010. In which you see that this area has been rebuilt. Although you can also see some of the, if you have a clear look, then you can also see that some of the structures have been more or less the same. But this is the rebuilt part of the city of Enschede. Okay, so now I will look into this rebuilding process in more detail. How to rebuild a traumatized city, how to do that? One of the approaches you could take, and it has also been suggested in this case just a few days after the disaster, let's clean up this mess. So let's ask some project developers to redesign this area, and we have this tabula rasa. That's kind of an ideal starting point for making a completely new part of the city. Also important to realize that this was a kind of a downridden part of Enschede, so it was a low social class living in that area, mainly lots of artists working there. So some people saw this as an opportunity to just make the whole thing better. But this is not what happened in Enschede. Instead, the municipality, the city leadership, was at the same time, of course, held responsible for the disaster, because they had been too lenient with giving permits to this fireworks storage facility. So they were kind of criticized, heavily criticized by the citizens and the victims of this disaster. So actually, as a result of that, they became more or less powerless. So they could not do much because they didn't have the support of the citizens anymore. So some other outsiders to this process stood up, and they developed an idea about how to include the citizens, the victims of this disaster, into this rebuilding process. So they developed a kind of extensive public participation procedure where citizens could also contribute to thinking about what should be done with this neighborhood. Then another measure that was introduced was the right to return. So all people of those 500 houses that were demolished had the right to return to this neighborhood. Maybe not to their specific property, but they could have the same cubic meters as they had before the disaster when they lived there. They could have the same amount of cubic meters than after this, in this rebuilt neighborhood. And they also increased private ownership, even to that extent that people could have a form of private commissionership where citizens or victims could ask an architect, okay, this is how I want my house to look like, and can you build it for me? Now I want to look a bit more detail to the role of obduracy, and then mainly by looking at, okay, what was considered worth preserving in this whole rebuilding exercise. And then very important also in terms of the town planning process that took place and the role of the town planning supervisor. combined with the role of this public participation in the rebuilding process was that they wanted to integrate the past with the present. So in the whole rebuilding process, a lot of emphasis was put on the role of the textile, history and industrial heritage, trying to preserve those buildings that were left. Also, they wanted to reuse a 19th century railway track and build a kind of public transport corridor on that specific location. And they tried to, well, in the past there were some like huge green areas, so-called cotton bleaching areas, and they redefined them into a kind of public parks. And then finally, they also wanted to keep the existing street pattern in place. That was a specific demand or a wish from the victims. Please, we want our street patterns and the names of the streets to be the same. The town planning supervisor I just mentioned said that wiping out the past, so demolishing everything else that was not demolished yet, would be a form of suicide. So he said we need the past also for our own identity. That is also, I think, an important reasoning behind this strategy. A few pictures. This is an old factory that is now transformed into a museum in that neighborhood. This is a water tower of a previous textile factory that's now turned into an apartment building. And a building for storing cotton that is now being turned into a museum as well. So I would say that these are the kind of more obdurate elements in this rebuilding process. At the same time, it's also incredible how fast the whole rebuilding process and the changes took place there. And to kind of explain this, also how change was then possible, I will focus on the notion of narratives of resilience. And I use this notion, I draw it on Vail and Campanella, book of 2005. I will be very quick. Narratives of resilience are stories that people assemble after a disaster to explain or inspire processes of recovery, and also to try to render tragedy in uplifting terms. I think those are important parts of this definition. I will give a few examples of how that happened in the case of this rebuilding. Our mission was to rebuild the city and make it better than before. We wanted to use the disaster as a source of power, as an opportunity for the city. That is a quote from a project director involved in this rebuilding process. Another one, the disaster offered enormous opportunities. I think we can safely conclude that now. Also a project manager involved in this rebuilding process. Actually, this kind of narrative was also shared by some of the victims of the disaster, because they said, well, this whole rebuilding process, it was so important for me to participate in it. It had a therapeutic effect. Part of the narratives of resilience, I will just quickly go through this, is that also Enschede the city itself was placed in a tradition of disasters and recovery, referring to earlier disasters that happened there and how the city then recovered from it, not only recovered, but also actually was able to innovate itself because of these disasters. So actually also then giving a positive spine to this whole disaster. Things that happened. And the phoenix symbol, the mythical bird, also played an important role in this. And this is a picture taken in a memorial room in this neighborhood. Okay, let's then briefly talk about conclusions, how to relate obduracy and disasters. Of course, disasters offer opportunities for urban innovation to overcome obduracy. Yet at the same time, I've argued that obduracy still plays a role in rebuilding cities after a disaster. And I think it's also important to look at the role of these narratives of resilience that also seem to play a kind of enabling role in urban socio-technical change, at least as a kind of inspiration for the process of recovery, and also to look at the important role of metaphors and symbols in this kind of narratives, like the notion of therapy, and also the phoenix reference. I want to thank you.
I'll be snippy, quick, and straightforward, hopefully, with 4 questions, keeping up with Kevin's theme of having more than one question. Well, one of the logics when we thought about the where to put the infrastructure section and the technology section was, let's put it at the end. Why put it at the end? Between the three fellows and Steve, Michael, it was a bit of a sense that maybe the discussion in the other sessions could have gone quite intangible, quite big, quite wide, quite not graspable. Luckily, there was a city life section that went very deep, but this was our attempt to sort of point out again that stuff matters a lot in cities, and that the materiality of the stuff is incredibly crucial in how we think through the city. Now, that said, and in the pure spirit of stealing from friends, and stealing from Alex again, something that popped up in the early career workshop is that actually this session happened already at least a couple of times in the other sessions, that technology and infrastructure cuts deeply across all the stuff that we talked about in the last day and a half, and it's almost virtually impossible to separate this session from what we've done before. And one thing that I thought that popped up a little bit, that I think it's an important reminder, is that there is a tension, especially sort of in Steve's and David's paper, there is a tension to start thinking about infrastructure and technology as big stuff, as fancy stuff, as innovative stuff. But most of the discussion of the actual urbanists in the planning rooms, in the municipalities and so forth, is about actually fairly technical stuff, fairly mundane stuff, fairly not sexy stuff. It's about garbage, it's about light bulbs, it's about numbers and calculations. And I think it's quite important to remember that, and it's quite important, Steve's reminder, that the little things do matter. So a couple of questions. And the first one starting from David's last picture from the Financial Times, especially having lived in the tallest of those buildings. You look at that picture and you're almost overwhelmed, as the whole session might actually give out, that there's very little flexibility actually. That there's a lot, that we're overwhelmed by all the things that are happening. There's a lot of growth. There's this unending obduracy, there's continuing large transitions and all this process, and amidst all of that noise, all of that sort of overwhelming stuff, it seems to me that there tends to be a focus on talking about what you might call archetypes of innovations. And you point, how many times have we seen in the last few days the picture of the Mazda car? Again, as Gordon was reminding us, it's $1 million car. They're not going to be, this is the small car that will take drunken Steve back home after the pub. How many times do we focus on that kind of stuff?
I wasn't there.
On camera.
I was in bed by 10:15.
Trying to look good. I am soldiering on through the day. Anyway, no, in all this seriousness, I do think that there's a tendency to get stuck on the archetypes of innovation, get stuck on these models that travel a lot, while actually the mundane, the little things also matter a lot. So my question to the rest of the panel, not Steve, is well, actually, in all these things that you're showing, what's the actual space for innovation? I feel a little, not sudden, but I feel a bit of anxiety, if we want to pick up a term that was used before, a bit of anxiety that you've got so much stuff and so little flexibility. Where's the innovation? Where's the creativity? And I think a more important question that is asked a little less is all of this a bit of a limit to the imagination? But actually, imagination is a circle of things that we see at every conference. We go to a conference tomorrow on this sort of stuff, we'll probably see very similar pictures. So where is the space for that actual radical change that Steve opened up with? Where's the radical change in Paris? Where's the radical change in the case of the disaster? Or, as a question to Anique, and the rest of the panel, so is mass disruption the only real radical change? So is Sandy the only thing that changes a bit New York, and does it change at all? Is a massive explosion what we need to get better housing in Oxford? Hopefully not. Hopefully, I will not comment on that on camera. So is massive disruption and is the mess the only stuff that gives us real change, real radical change? And the reason why I'm saying that is that the other risk in sort of all this talk, without pointing in anyone in particular, is that we present all the sort of transitions and all these issues about technologies as pure matter of fact. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of maps, there's a lot of all this. That's always very taken so much as a matter of fact. Can they be matter of concern? Can we put these things in play and play with them politically, as Jonathan was alluding to? So where are the politics of innovation played in all of this? And are they played by a selected few? Is it just a little cadre of innovators that go around and sell innovations? And the last thing, sort of to go back where we started with Neil Brenner, is there's this sort of sense of looking into the idea of the extended urbanization, looking at the operational landscape and these very, very big things. But it seems to me, especially sort of from the presentations here, that then we're risking also flattening this by the use of maps, by the use of data, by the use of comparative stories. Where's the depth? Where's the not just the physical depth or the scholar depth, but even the historical depth, of this? How do we get to from the big numbers that David is showing to the story of a bike used in a street in Shanghai or Tianjin? And is the only way to do that the vignette, the ethnographic snippet, or how do we reconcile Steve's vignettes with the massive disruptions and the big numbers and so forth? And if I can throw a provocation, or a question directly, sorry, shut up, to David. So what's an unmundane technology, and how do we get it? I quickly scribble when you said I like it. I could like it. I just need to be persuaded. So if it's because I spent so much time with Steve and mundane technologies, it'd be good to do an unmundane technology. So what is it? Is it a major intervention because all this stuff is actually very path dependent, or is it a brand new idea? And can you have a brand new idea in all this path dependency? Or is an unmundane technology that you say is so much needed just a very controversial technology? We throw a completely radical idea. We know it's not going to work, but let's throw a spanner in the system and create disruption. And I end this in an entirely radical way. I didn't want to. I'm an anarchist. No, I'm kidding. I'll leave it to you guys. Brilliant stuff, and very, very good to get back to the stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ecole. Thank you for summarising and discussing the four papers, but also pointing us towards maybe concluding some comments to bring the 2 days together. I propose now 3 questions, and then the discussants, the speakers can answer Michele's questions and the 4 from the floor. Should we have 4 from the floor? Yes, someone.
Very quickly, first to start with Steve. Sorry. Do you think there's a danger that we get to depend on these technologies? And in a sense, a failure to think. I'm just thinking of an example of a boiler that Ponts are. The alternative is to boil a kettle, pour a bottle of water in and have a bath. And my son doesn't think answer that's possible. He asked me about my Indian ways of doing things. So it's about that lack of forgetting how to deal with things. The second one to David is, do you think we need political will for the kinds of things that you proposed in your report happening? I'm thinking of the fact that in New Delhi, in Mumbai, in Chennai, there are no pavements. They've disappeared. Either been encroached or people just put plants on them. You can't walk in that city. I'm thinking of Beijing, where a bicycle lane, which is as big as a car lane, has completely disappeared. So what is our challenge there? And finally to Anique, this whole notion of disasters, and I'm thinking about the tsunami which hit Tamil Nadu and Chennai, and how there was almost a plan, therefore, to resettle people as a result of that, on the grounds of the dangers of living in such zones. But once they've been resettled, those zones get replaced by luxury housing and hotels, with flood defenses put into place. So the notion of when the opportunities also might arise for certain plans that are in place, or settlements being deliberately set on fire to evict people so that those land values can be used.
That's 3 questions. One
Yes,
more.
you know, it's,
Just 3 more. So, gentleman about there and there.
I'm very interested in the issue of governance, which everybody seems to be just sort of sidestepping. And so the question really is about the cultural and political mechanisms and models, if you like, the structures that need to be in place to make some of these things happen. We know in this country we've ground to a halt. We can't do an airport, we can't do a train line, we can't do housing, we've ground to a halt. So our political structures and our mechanisms that we have in place in this country are not able to cope with the small amount of change that we have to deal with. So the question is, you know, what are the political mechanisms? Would we be better in a political environment like China, which is a state capitalism and we can just get on and do it, or the democracy that was discussed about change in Scandinavia with regard to the humanization, if you like, of our civic space?
Thank you. And I think those 3 hands went up together. So if Matthew as well, to have 3 quick questions, and then the speakers can respond. And yes,
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a commentary that relates both to Steve's and David's presentations. I think that, well, Steve gave an inspiring presentation. I really enjoyed it. But I also think about the danger of innovation. I'm thinking about the Charter of Athens in 1925, where innovation for cities was thought to be the separation of housing, work, leisure, and transport. Of course, I'm simplifying the modern movement, which is much more than that. But I want to refer to the risk of not recognizing the values of the present, the richness of the present when we think of change. And my other comment, referring to David's talk, which I think it was a magnificent presentation as well, but returning to this preoccupation about the richness of the present, I'm worried about that demonization, I don't know if that word exists in English, a demonization of movement and mobility, and of forgetting what mobility brings to urban life. I have read a recent paper referring to the need to go back to neighborhood life, which I think well, for me, it's a fearful scenario, for it may imply lives surrounded by sameness rather than the conviviality of differences. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, just two quick questions. Firstly, for Steve, how do we conceptualize the relationship between human imagination and public policy? And secondly,
5 seconds.
but for Jonathan, active urban materiality, are we yet post-Latourian?
The last quick question.
We were never Latourian.
Getting towards the ontological.
We were never.
Yes.
I've got a question for Anique. I was very pleased to see your case study. I was actually hoping for it when you started your presentation. I thought maybe you're going to talk about Enschede. I used to study there. A lot of my friends lived in the area that you're talking about, Roombeek. And what I recall from being there at the time, that it was a deprived area, very much so. Sort of both having a composition of sort of particularly white sort of underclass plus students, sort of that sort of combination. And when I came back, sort of, my parents live in the area, so I came back a couple of years ago, and I went through this area, and it struck me very much that the area had been it seemed to be completely gentrified. Now, you note, I mean, some of the pictures also actually highlighted that, the beautiful green spaces, beautiful houses, I mean, sort of tailor-made, sort of highly architectural. But my question really was sort of, in terms of using your follow the methods approach, follow the actors approach, it struck me in terms of the quotes that you're using, quotes from bankers, from the policy makers, but what about sort of quotes from the sort of deprived community? And did their sense of resilience look the same as the sense of resilience and the narratives of resilience that sort of these sort of policy makers and sort of investment sort of communities were using?
Thank you. Well, I think the richness of the papers has provided us with 14 questions. So I'd like, maybe Steve, would you want to start off in response?
Yeah, well, I'll sort of try and push a few of them together and say four things. Firstly, provoked by Sunil about the dependence on technology. I was often struck by the saying of A.N. Whitehead 100 years ago that civilization advances not by increasing the number of things we have to worry about every day, but by decreasing the number of things we have to worry about so that we can be free to think about really important stuff like the meaning of life or who's going to win the soccer on Saturday. You know, and I do sort of wonder sometimes whether the contemporary insistence on increasing consciousness and awareness of what we're doing, environmental, etc., isn't in some sense a reversion to barbarism. And I'm not so sure that actually, that in fact, part of the purpose of technology is precisely to allow us to depend on it, to rely on it, and not to have to be too conscious of it all of the time. And I think that then I'll sort of take up the issue that John raised about cultural mechanisms in China. I gave some evidence to the Oxford Martin Commission on the Future, in which I said, look, if you're really concerned about the problem of long-term planning, you have to face the reality that long-term planning is done by hierarchies. It's hierarchical societies that think long-term. If you think cathedrals, you think pyramids, you think irrigation systems, massive irrigation empires, none of these was ever produced by hunters and gatherers. I'm sorry, I'm an anthropologist, so I tend to think in these kinds of terms. And unfortunately, hierarchy is very, very unfashionable at the moment. And so the notion that somehow you have to reintroduce some element of hierarchy, if indeed you are going to have any kind of a long-term perspective, is a difficult one to get across. And the Commission's initial response was, God, do you want us to defend authoritarianism? And the answer is no. It's a question of actually how do you mix hierarchy in with competition, if you like, the market, and collaboration, sort of the more civil, voluntaristic forms of society as well. And you know, I just would put it to you that there are ways to do this, and in fact many long-lasting institutions are the ones that have done it quite successfully. So if you think about armies, for example, soldiers don't die for king and country, they die for their mates because they're in egalitarian squads. But in order to coordinate them, you have to have some kind of command structure of hierarchy. But those don't work very well unless you've got an inspiring leader there as well. So you've in fact got all three different ways of organising that actually make military structures fairly stable structures that actually do the work that they set out to do. So I think there are things that we can think about how we combine those different ways of organising, and maybe we have to recognise that there is a role for hierarchy despite its current unfashionableness. Neglecting the present. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. The whole rationale of the flexible city motif for our programme was how do you conserve identity? How do you preserve the sense of place that makes people value where they are? The sort of things that Anique was talking about in terms of the recovery after the disaster that she was telling us about. How do you do that at the same time as actually building in the flexibility to enable urban spaces and populations to be able to adjust to changes in environmental conditions, economic conditions, political conditions, and so on and so forth, without actually having to go through vast amounts of trauma. I don't think that, in fact, that trauma is the only way you get radical change. It depends what you mean by radical change, and I think about, for example, the 50 years that it took to go from the ending of the Red Flag Act to the fact that you had huge infrastructures for motor cars, and they had come to dominate the urban landscape. It was only 50 years, from basically the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century. It's only 50 years since the era before mass air transportation. As a child, as a child of a British Army family, I was shipped out to Singapore and back by ship. This was in the 1950s. It's only really since the 1960s and 70s that mass air travel has opened up in the way it has. That's a fantastically fast pace of change, I would argue, on the kind of scale of obduracy for urban environments that we're really setting these kinds of things against. Matt, your question I couldn't begin to address in a few sentences. How do you conceptualize the imagination or bring together this idea of the imagination and policy? I think it's a fundamental problem of the fact that we are now in an era of the politics of means and not the politics of ends, where basically competition is about how to better implement a particular set of programs about which there is no real fundamental debate about whether those programmatic ends are in fact the appropriate ones to pursue. And I think in that respect, we have to address that much broader political problem, which is far, far wider than the kind of city focus that we have today. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. And David, would you like to take up the...
Yeah, do you want a quarter an hour or half an hour for lunch?
Well, at the moment it's a working lunch without lunch, so it's
a working lunch.
Over to you.
I won't try and answer individual questions, but say just two or three things that strike me, particularly from where I come from. I think the first thing is questioning the whole role of hardware or technology and other forms of innovation in terms of what it's actually trying to achieve. If it's seen as a solution to the problems that society as a whole and society within cities is facing, I think it is misplaced. It is part of the solution, it can help, but underlying it, and this is where perhaps the unmundane come into it, is about what a city is there for, the software, the issues relating to creativity, what's called imagination, I suppose, changing social norms. So really it's taking a long, hard look at what those cities are actually there for. And in my area, say, in transport, it's saying, right, well, we have this streetscape. Whose street is it? That's the question about ownership. If you have ownership of that space, then it's used in a very different way than if it's there just for cars. Cars create a whole set of other problems. So it's being able to sort of say, this is what we've got, how can we actually use it to the best sort of possible way? And indirectly related to that, it's sort of saying, not just what I was saying about management, it's the whole notion of cities and consumption. Cities are huge consumers of resources. So yesterday was mentioned notions about circular economies and things that we haven't really talked about. Think of a notion of the shared city. The city that actually you don't own things, you buy access to things, you buy access to services, that sort of thing. This is what I'm thinking about in terms of unmundane, is the notion of the way in which the patterns have evolved. And as Steve was saying, a lot of this is historical, it appears over a period of time, and this is the way we get locked into thinking about various things. We, even as academics, are not good, I feel, thinking about tangential things that could change the dynamic within cities. Now, having said that, the question about demonising mobility, I think, is an important one. I mean, but what I learned from that is that, yes, transport mobility is essential. The way in which the society is organised depends upon it, probably too much dependent upon it. It is often the weak link in the network system. It does bring huge benefits, and it's likely to bring more. But in many cases, the technologies that are introduced here have counterintuitive, have different outcomes to what we actually expect them to do. So, for instance, the notions of rebound effects and that sort of thing, if we're doing things in a sense more environmentally green, does that mean to say that we do more of it rather than it's not the same? So things change in very dynamic and subtle ways, and this is what we ought to be trying to understand. In a sense, how do we change the norms? And I'll just end up with one of my favourite quotes, which is from a book called The Leopard, which some people say is the best book ever written, but probably not many of you have read it, by a guy called Giuseppe Lampedusa. And if in one stage he says, if you want things to stay the same, then things will have to change.
And Anique and John.
Great Visconti movie.
I mean, I haven't got not a tremendous amount to add, to be honest. Where's the radical change in Paris? That's a good question, but I would say some of the stuff I was presenting on Paris might be tension, it might be conflict, it might be blockage, obstacle, but it might also be incremental possibilities or possibilities for future change. So I'm not interested in conflicts as blockages, as obstacles, I'm less interested in that kind of thing than interested in the ways in which those tensions actually reveal future possibilities for future pathways, which might be more easier to do in the future. So I would say that the one thing that I didn't talk about very much was the ideas of upscaling governance, the idea of even in a kind of very complex French political system where you've got different levels of governance, the idea of introducing this new, what we call Paris Metropole, which might come in and sit somewhere between the state, the region and the municipalities, and partly deal with some of these network or infrastructure questions is quite interesting, and that's on the table at the moment, and a lot of the actors, when we talk to them, are favourable towards that, so that might be some future way of doing things. And in terms of district heating, in terms of the scale, which relies on economies of scale, which relies on interconnections and being able to use and to put different kinds of resources through the network at different times and at different periods of the year, etc., then some kind of new scale in the Paris region could be, as an organisational tool to help to do that, could be potentially a radical step forward. In terms of the cultural and political mechanisms needed to make things work, if you compare Sweden to France, for example, then the carbon tax is a clear mechanism which has worked in Sweden in terms of having been introduced 20 years ago, having been set at a significant level, having forced district heating companies all across Sweden to take fossil fuels out of their system and replace them with biomass. When there was a discussion about introducing a carbon tax in France a couple of years ago, this was blocked and taken off the table quite quickly. So there's no. Again, it's hard to interpret the Paris or the French situation, but this draws in questions of resources as well, because if you use a carbon tax, then you have to have the resources to be able to input alternative fuels or alternative things into the system. And in Sweden, they have quite a good logistics and industrial system for bringing biomass and different kinds of wood to plants and things like that. And in France, that's another big question. The whole question of logistics, bringing the resources to the Paris region for burning, for heat provision is a massive question. Active urban materiality post-Latourian. Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm interested actually in discussing more about.
I think we might suggest a Latourian table at lunchtime. So
absolutely.
We can go into that.
I'm very interested in the notion of one of your colleagues. I think Alan Latham talks about ordering, circulation, and manipulation of things, and it's I don't consider myself to be a Latourian, but it's the manipulation which is kind of quite interesting, which maybe offers something new, but I couldn't really say anything more than that without thinking a lot more about it. And I'm also interested in this active urban materiality. I'm also interested in looking back to some of the pre-Latourian STS work around large technical systems, where they talked about momentum and seamless webs, which kind of filtered into active network theory in the late 80s and things like that. And I think some of the kinds of post-Latourian and pre-Latourian dialogue could be quite interesting from an intellectual position. Myself, with great ontological uncertainty in the way I think about things like that, and I think that could be quite interesting to think more about that, but I'd have to think more about it.
Anique.
Yeah, I will keep it very brief.
Well, no,
Everyone
you have
is
your
wanting to have lunch. I will just try to combine two questions I had about the issue of gentrification and whether a disaster like the one in Enschede is used by the city leadership to just put in like luxury houses and replace the existing poor population by higher upper class population. Yeah, of course, when you read the literature on this, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine and others writing about disaster capitalism, this is the idea. This is what you would expect that is going to happen in a situation like this. And partly it also happened, because you're right that it's not true that the poor population is replaced by a richer one, but they added like 30% houses in a higher upper class, richer category to the existing housing stock. So they actually did not replace, but they added richer, more expensive houses to it. So in general, also the way the whole process was organized, it was not really, as I said, top-down, municipality taking the lead, but really bottom-up, asking the population. And I also interviewed victims about how they see the process. And there's also been some research about the whole participation process. And actually, also the victims say, yeah, we were happy with the environment, with the neighborhood as it is now. So that was quite surprising also to me, I must say. But maybe this is just one exception, or maybe I'm still too naive after years of studying this, but this is actually my conclusion about this.
Are major sporting events artificial disasters?
Sorry?
I said, are major sporting events artificial
That's
disasters?
a lunchtime discussion.
It is.
I just
Discuss.
Discuss.